So one of my favorite movie franchises of all time is the Back to the Future movie franchise. These films are fun, exciting, and so much fun. So today I thought I would do a best and worst of the Back to the Future films, and at the outside, which is the worst Back to the Future film, and which is the best. And of course, major spoilers for all three of these films. If you haven't seen them, skip ahead as you please. Alright, let's talk about it. So first things first, we start off with the first Back to the Future film. And already, this film is just so much fun. This is just such a fun, enjoyable 80s film from start to finish. You got the insane cast. You have Marty McFly, just such a fun and just enjoyable character to go off on these adventures. You have Doc Brown, this fun, insane, quirky scientist, and they have absolutely fantastic chemistry. You have the great direction. You have the amazing score. This has one of the best film scores of all time. I absolutely love this film's score. You have the 80s setting, but then you also have the 50s setting. This is one of the most interesting and most fun films I have ever seen, because this is just such an enjoyably great concept for a 80s summer blockbuster. You have a goofy scientist that I've already mentioned inventing a time machine to go back in time, and then a kid from the 80s goes back all the way to the 50s when his parents were in school, and you got to see what they did, and then your mom falls in love with you instead of your father. It's just such a fun, quirky, and just enjoyable concept that I absolutely love. That's what I love so much about 80s films that we don't really get nowadays. Fun, original, just enjoyable concept. This is an interestingly, gleefully enjoyable film because of its editing, the action sequences, or I guess the fun little. There's such an amazing. There's one where Bill chases Marty McFly, which has now turned the name to Calvin Klein, and then he takes his kids' kind of like scooter skateboard things. That's a really fun and exciting sequence, and this is such a fun idea of time travel. I've always enjoyed time travel-esque films. It's fast-paced. It's really enjoyable. Any problems with this film? Not really. It's one of the most enjoyable films of all time, and of course, I want to give Back to the Future an A+. So now we get to the sequel, Back to the Future Part 2. And even though it's not as good as the first one, there's still a lot of great parts in this film. First of all, you have that this film, they go to the future, and they go to October 21st, 2015. And this is such a fun and exciting. It's such interesting to see what people back in the 80s thought that the 2015 would look like, with flying cars, and it was 19, because back in the 80s and 70s there was hundreds of Jaws coming out practically every single year. And this is just, there's hoverboards, and there's just so many interesting things that are in this film that just make it so much fun. There's little pizzas that look like a cookie. You put them in this little microwave, and they're done in an instant second, and then they're done, and they have a full massive pizza. It's so much fun. There's doors that you can just put your thumbprint against the door and lets you in. There's a sports almanac that you can bet on sports events. It's just, even though I don't think it's as good as the first, I think it's more creative with the first, going to, as I said, the future, going to an alternate timeline of the 1980s, and then going back to the 50s to get the almanac from Biff, who becomes a really rich person in the ultimate 80s, and then just kind of becomes the best person. And those 50 sequences are so much fun. It's just fun to go back to the setting that I loved so much about the first one, and then of course the fun little twerky kind of nature of those sequences. I absolutely think it's amazing. There's one sequence in particular where Biff is in his car after going dance, and Marty's trying to get the book, and he's on his hoverboard. And he's using his hoverboard. It's just a fun, action-packed sequence. And even though there is a lot of retrend, like in the future aspects, there's another chase scene that was very reminiscent to the first one. But this is a fun enjoyable, interesting film that uses so many different timelines and relations. The cast is still really fun. You have a lot of fun quirkiness. It's much more creative than the first, but still kind of having that fun energy that the first one did. The direction and editing and the writing. I haven't talked about the writing for the films, but it's such a fun set of writing. The writing is so smart and so witty and so clever, and it really does make this film so much fun. Yes, it is a bit of a pure copy of the first one, but I think all the third ones did. And compared to this, the third one, this definitely does it a lot better of being a pure copy. But there's also some different elements that really makes this film a lot of fun. Any problems with the film? While I do really enjoy the first act a lot of the future aspect, and then the third act with the back to the 50s aspect. The second act of the ultimate timeline 80s thing, there's a lot of good scenes in there, like when Marty goes into his house, but it's somebody else's house. But mostly those scenes I just didn't really enjoy. There was some interesting aspects of kind of It's a Wonderful Life kind of thing, where it's not really what it seemed, but it didn't really work for me. The jokes kind of fell flat, and there is some noticeable CGI green screen that the first one didn't really have. But overall, Back to the Future 2 is a lot of fun, and it's such a fun, enjoyable film, and I'm going to give Back to the Future Part 2 an A-. Now we get to Back to the Future Part 3, and I don't like this film. I've never had liked this film. I think it's a dull, uninteresting, pretty boring Back to the Future conclusion. There's a lot of stuff I like, but what I like isn't much. First of all, the premise. Them going back into the Old West to save Doc McBrown from getting shot by kind of another Biff wannabe. We'll get to him. That's a lot of fun. I really do like those kind of nods and twerks. That's a lot of fun. The setting of the Old West, I absolutely love the setting, the costume design, the world, the little world that this builds up, kind of tweaking with, even though it's not as creative as the second one, I really do wish they would have done a lot more with this film, but we'll get to that in a second. I think the cast is still really stellar. The writing is still all around really fun. The direction is why it's my least favorite. The way it's directed is definitely, it kind of takes a back seat from what we're used to from the first and second, but it's still a lot of fun. Even though this film is really long, too long in my opinion, it still goes at a pretty brisk pace from some things that in Back to the Future 2 were a bit slow. This one definitely does start off a lot quicker. It literally picks up right after the second one, after Doc has been shoot off from lightning and they have to go back to the Old West. I do like that aspect of the film. The final, the kind of when they're on the train tracks and trying to get the DeLorean to 88 miles per hour, that's a really fun scene. And really what drives me insane so much about Back to the Future 3 is there's so many great scenes and moments and little character tweak elements that I absolutely love for this film. But there's also some absolute garbage moments, which now we're about to get into. First of all, they don't do really much with this Old West setting. We stay in the town that we've been accustomed to, and Back to the Future 2, and now Back to the Future 3, and it's all a similar feel. And yes, it's an Old West, but it feels the same. Let's go to a different element and a different area. We've had 2 films of this, and I wish we would have done to a different. Secondly, this is too much like the first and the second. The second one, it did a lot more different things, but this is almost a shot-for-shot copy of so many elements and beats. He goes in the house and he thinks it's his mom, and there's a lot of jokes about that. And the second one, I was like, okay, that was a fun callback. But by the third time they've done it, I'm like, okay. And yes, there can be a lot of films that copy and paste the formula from the first one. The Star Wars, the original trilogy, does this pretty well. The Indiana Jones trilogy is a fantastic example of how to do this properly and really excitingly. The music, I think, is the least interesting. There's some really good cues of music and really, really amps up in the more exciting aspects of this film. But mostly it's just kind of an old West, kind of a good, the bad, the ugly kind of copy type thing. And it's just not really that interesting to me. The editing and pacing of this film really does drag. I really like the first act. The first act, you get straight into it. You get a lot more you get up to speed, and you get into the Old West. You get a fantastic Indian sequence with the DeLorean. That's a lot of fun. The bear. But the second act, and then the third act really does pick up. But the second act, where Doc meets his girlfriend, really does drag for me. And this is really where my biggest problem with the film. I have no problems with girlfriends in films. I just didn't like her as a character. The way she's introduced feels really forced. Like, I'm really kind of getting introduced, kind of interested of how Doc and Marty are going to get out of this situation. But then she's just thrown straight into it, and it just felt abrupt. It just felt like, oh wait, there's a female character in this film as well. Let's have her actually do something. And it just didn't really work for me as much as I really wanted it to. And those scenes are just so not interesting. And it's not because there's not any insane, like, funny gags or bits happening. It's the writing is boring, it's bland, and the direction of these sequences and the acting performances are really cringy and just really odd, and I just don't really care so much about these characters as much as I wanted to. And also, Doc Brown is not the same person from Back to the Future 1 and 2. He's a much more, I think they really got tired. Same with Michael J. Fox as Marty McFly. It just doesn't feel like the same person. It feels like they're tired of this franchise, and I can really do feel like this film just has not the energy of the first two, but especially the first one. But even the second one, it had fast-paced energy. You were always moving. Even if there's an exposition sequence, you're always something's interesting happening in the first and second one. This one, there's a lot of kind of sitting around and kind of walking around and kind of, yes, you do get used to the area, but I'm just not interested in this film. This was the last film. This should have been a Return of the King. This should have been an Avengers Endgame. This should have been a great climactic climax and a great finale to what have been. If this film was great, this would have been one of the best trilogies of all time. But since this film is dull, not interesting, let's talk about the Biff type character in the Old West type scenario. I don't like him. He's a dull, uninteresting. He's a bit of a buffoon like Biff and Riff from 1 and 2 were, but not in an interesting and fun, comedic way. He's just annoying. He's just a bumbling idiot who doesn't really know what he's doing. Not really much. Another scene I really like is when they go back to 1980s and Marty does not take the race from Needles that got in the car accident and hurt his hand from that we mentioned in 2. I thought that was a really fun. And really what I like about all three of these films is how much they connect. You have to see 1 to get to 2. You have to see 2 to understand 3. And you have to see 3 to understand 2. And there's a lot of interesting moments, and I really do liked about these films. This film I just felt was dull, uninteresting, and not really exciting. I'm going to give Back to the Future Part 3 a C. Films. What do you think of all these? Let me know your guys' thoughts down in the comment section below. Like this video, guys, haven't already. Subscribe for more content like the one you just watched. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you guys next time. General out.